Welcome. You are listening to Classic Story Cast. This is Pride and Prejudice, Chapter 3. Mrs. Bennet and her 5 daughters tried hard to get information about Mr. Bingley from Mr. Bennet, but he didn't give them a clear answer. They asked him directly, made guesses, and speculated, but he avoided their questions. Eventually, they had to rely on their neighbor, Lady Lucas, for news. She had good things to say about Mr. Bingley. Sir William was very impressed with him. He was young, very handsome, and friendly. To top it off, he planned to attend the next dance with a big group. This was exciting. Mrs. Bennet thought that if one of her daughters could marry Mr. Bingley, and the others could marry well too, she would be very happy. A few days later, Mr. Bingley visited Mr. Bennet for about 10 minutes in his library. Mr. Bingley hoped to meet the young ladies he had heard so much about, but he only met their father. The daughters had better luck, as they saw him from an upper window wearing a blue coat and riding a black horse. Soon after, they sent him an invitation to dinner. Mrs. Bennet was already planning the menu when they received a reply that changed everything. Mr. Bingley had to go to town the next day, and couldn't accept their invitation. Mrs. Bennet was upset. She couldn't understand why he needed to go to town so soon after arriving. She worried he might never settle down at Netherfield. Lady Lucas calmed her fears a bit by suggesting he might be going to London to gather a big group for the ball. Soon it was rumored that Mr. Bingley would bring 12 ladies and 7 gentlemen to the assembly. The girls were worried about so many ladies, but they felt better when they heard he was bringing only 6, his 5 sisters and a cousin. When they arrived at the assembly, the group was just 5 people. Mr. Bingley, his 2 sisters, his brother-in-law, and another young man. Mr. Bingley was handsome and charming. He had a friendly face and easy manners. His sisters were stylish women. Mr. Hurst, his brother-in-law, looked like a gentleman, but Mr. Darcy quickly caught everyone's attention with his tall figure, good looks, and the rumor that he had a large fortune. The men thought he was impressive, and the women said he was even better looking than Mr. Bingley. For half the evening, he was admired until his pride turned people against him. He seemed aloof and uninterested in others, and even his wealth couldn't save him from being seen as unfriendly compared to Mr. Bingley. Mr. Bingley quickly made friends with everyone in the room. He was lively, danced every dance, was upset when the ball ended early, and talked about hosting a ball at Netherfield. His friendly nature was a stark contrast to Mr. Darcy, who only danced once with Mrs. Hurst and once with Miss Bingley. He refused to dance with any other lady, and spent the rest of the evening walking around, occasionally speaking to his own group. His character was clear. He was the proudest and most unpleasant man, and everyone hoped he wouldn't return. Mrs. Bennet was especially upset with him for ignoring one of her daughters. Elizabeth Bennet had to sit out 2 dances because there weren't enough men. During that time, she overheard a conversation between Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy. Mr. Bingley urged Mr. Darcy to dance. "Come on, Darcy," Mr. Bingley said. "You should dance. I hate seeing you standing there alone. You'd be better off dancing." "I won't," Mr. Darcy replied. "You know I dislike it unless I know my partner well. In a place like this it would be unbearable. Your sisters are busy, and there isn't another woman here I'd want to dance with." "I wouldn't be so picky," Mr. Bingley said. "I've never met so many lovely girls as I have tonight, and some of them are very pretty." "You are dancing with the only attractive girl here," Mr. Darcy said, looking at the eldest Miss Bennet. "Oh, she's the most beautiful person I've ever seen. But There's another sister sitting behind you who is also pretty and likely very nice. Let me ask my partner to introduce you." "Which one?" Mr. Darcy asked, turning to look at Elizabeth. When he caught her eye, he looked away and said coldly, "She's acceptable, but not pretty enough to interest me. I am not in the mood to pay attention to young ladies who aren't noticed by other men. You should go back to your partner and enjoy her company. You're wasting your time with me." Mr. Bingley took his advice and walked away. Mr. Darcy left, and Elizabeth felt annoyed with him. However, she shared the story with her friends, enjoying the ridiculousness of it. Overall, the evening went well for the family. Mrs. Bennet saw her eldest daughter admired by the Netherfield group. Mr. Bingley danced with Jane twice, and his sisters noticed her too. Jane was pleased, though more quietly than her mother. Elizabeth shared in Jane's happiness. Mary was mentioned to Miss Bingley as the most accomplished girl around, and Catherine and Lydia were lucky enough to have partners for every dance, which was all they cared about at a ball. They returned home in good spirits to Longbourn, their village, where they were the main resident. Mr. Bennet was still awake, curious about the evening that had raised such high hopes. He had hoped his wife would be disappointed in Mr. Bingley, but he soon learned otherwise. "Oh, my dear Mr. Bennet," she said as she entered the room, "we had a wonderful evening, an excellent ball. I wish you had been there." Jane was so admired, it was incredible. Everyone said how lovely she looked, and Mr. Bingley thought she was beautiful, and danced with her twice. Just think of that. He actually danced with her twice. She was the only one he asked to dance with a second time. First, he asked Miss Lucas, which annoyed me, but he didn't like her at all. No one can. And he seemed quite taken with Jane as she danced. He asked who she was, got introduced, and asked her to dance again. Then he danced with Miss King, then with Maria Lucas, and then with Jane again, and then with Lizzie, and the Boulanger. If he had any pity for me, Mr. Bennet interrupted impatiently, he wouldn't have danced so much. For heaven's sake, stop talking about his partners. I wish he had sprained his ankle during the first dance. Oh, my dear, I'm so pleased with him. He's so incredibly handsome. And his sisters are lovely. I've never seen anything more elegant than their dresses. I bet the lace on Mrs. Hurst's gown. Mr. Bennet cut her off, saying he didn't want to hear about fancy clothes. So she changed the subject and shared her annoyance about Mr. Darcy's rudeness. "But I assure you," she added, "Lizzie isn't missing out by not catching his eye. He's a very disagreeable, horrible man, not worth trying to impress. He's so proud and conceited that he's unbearable. He walked around thinking he was so important, not handsome enough to dance with. I wish you had been there, my dear, to give him a piece of your mind. I really can't stand the man.